is Andrew Britton, and I'm with the Biscayne Community Foundation and Life Enhancement Forum are the ones that present this particular, or host this particular lecture series. This is one of many lecture series that we've had throughout 2018 and 2019 on healthy eating habits with, of course, the venerable Dr. Koffler. Today we'll be talking about who wants more energy, the importance of mitochondria. But before that, let me introduce Dr. Koffler, and then we can begin the show. For those that are not familiar with Dr. Koffler, although I see a lot of familiar faces from past presentations, she is currently the medical director for the Osher Center for Integrative Medicine at the University of Miami. Her practice philosophy is simple. Humans have an intrinsic capacity to heal. Her job is to work with the patient to optimize the body's healing powers using the functional medicine model. Before Dr. Koffler received her medical degree at the University of Miami while completing her training in internal medicine in Chicago and at the University of Colorado, and was actually one of the first individuals to be part of the first class of physicians to study directly with Dr. Wow at the University of Arizona. She was also one of the first physicians certified by the Institute for Functional Medicine.
Yeah.
Without further ado,
Thank you. Okay. Just say thank you guys for coming out. I mean, it's not, I can't say it's a rainy day, it's a cold, blustery day. It's a gorgeous night, but it's nice for you to be here, even though we are indoors, to learn about probably the single most common thing I see in my practice, which is in addition to different diagnoses or more along the lines of prevention, not too many people I know are satisfied with the amount of energy that they have. Anybody in this room feel like you have an overabundance? So then you guys, you can either, who has an overabundance of energy? Because I do see there are people on occasion, I see, and we should study you. We should follow you around. We should understand everything you're doing all the time. So integrative medicine, who's familiar with the term integrative medicine? Okay, great, it's getting better. When I first started doing these talks in 1997, I would say integrative and people would have no idea what I'm talking about. So integrative medicine is a healing orientation to the patient, as opposed to conventional medicine, and my apologies to any doctors in the room, but in conventional medicine, we have more of a disease orientation. Integrative medicine has more of a healing orientation, meaning let's understand how the body is designed to heal, and let's figure out ways to support that. It believes in the importance of the doctor-patient relationship as a therapeutic tool in and of itself. Which I think is we're losing quite a bit in conventional medicine. The presence of the doctor, the attention of the doctor, and having computers that we have to work on really detracts now from that relationship. We believe that lifestyle has an enormous impact on day-to-day functioning in patients and the development of health and the development of disease. And we are willing to make use of what's considered alternative therapies, because in reality, alternative depends on what country you happen to be standing in at the moment. And because many therapies have been in use for thousands of years, so they've withstood the test of time, and we're constantly discovering new things, and we're constantly figuring out new approaches that are effective. Unfortunately, in conventional medicine, it's a very slow, we're slow to adopt new practices, particularly if they come from outside of institutions. We're more readily able to adopt practices that are actually created by academia, for instance. We're more reticent when, energy healers come up with a new way of doing things. We tend to look at them as scants, or at least conventional docs do. An integrative medicine view of energy, when patients tell me they're tired, my mind is thinking through a series of things. And I actually start at a very fundamental level, which is within the cell. And then I begin to think in larger and larger terms. So we're going to walk through what the way I think through patients who are suffering from a lack of energy. So how do we create energy? What are the two essential ingredients? Nutrients, that's right, and breath, right? What do we get from the breath? Oxygen. So really, we are manifestations of the sun's energy, right? Because if you think about it, the photons of the sun influence plants, right? They affect, who remembers what structure they affect in, who said chlorophyll? Our mycologist, that's right, chlorophyll. And what does chlorophyll produce? Why should we all have houseplants? Oxygen. So we are directly related. Our health is intimately related to the health of plants. And by the way, ferns are some of the best houseplants you can have in terms of detoxifying and oxygen producing, but that's an aside. Okay, so what are some of the things that interfere with our ability to generate adequate energy? They include things like toxins, malnutrition, which I see a lot of. So while we are a very well-fed society, we are not always a very well-nourished society. In other words, we're not necessarily always getting the nutrients that we need. We're definitely getting the calories, most of us, that we need. When there's a lack of communication within the body, and we'll talk more about what that exactly means, the cells, if they're not being spoken to properly, if they're not interpreting signals that the body is sending out, we may not be able to generate enough energy. And then, super common in our culture today is just the fact that we don't restore. We've forgotten how to so who observes the Sabbath? So you are at rest. You don't schedule.
No, not totally.
So is there nobody in this room that takes one day where they do nothing with the outside world, they just take it easy? Are you kidding me? Okay, good. There are a handful of people. Okay, that's very important. Very, very important that we don't do that. You know, Aboriginal tribes will spend about a day or two gathering food and then 3 days resting. And we sort of do the opposite, but on steroids. Okay, so what structure is this? You already heard about it. This is an electron micrograph of a mitochondria, and this is how you look. You actually are a lovely sack of these things. Okay, this is your cell, and the sort of pale tan with blue inside structures are the mitochondria. The large purple structure is the nucleus, which houses the DNA. You guys remember this from biology in 9th grade, right? And then on the surface, notice all those little hairs, which are not, that's not really an accurate image, but in some ways it is. There are all these little things sticking out. Does anybody know what those are? It would be cilia if it was part of a tissue, but within each cell, or on the surface of each cell, those are receptors. That is what's receiving information from the rest of the body. That's what's receiving your food. And so really many of us think that the cell membrane is the brain of the body, of the cell, because it's through the action of those receptors, what they let in and out, that influences how the cell functions. But we're not concentrating on those guys today. We're concentrating on those mitochondria. And you have the greatest amount of them, up to thousands, 10,000 in a heart muscle cell or within a nerve cell. The most metabolically active cells have the greatest number of mitochondria. Why? Because those guys are producing energy. Now, I love this part of it. You got 100% of the mitochondria that are in you right now from your mother. Nothing, I'm sorry to say to the men in this room, from your father. Because when the sperm is swimming towards the egg, whether it's carrying an XX or an XY, it has about 2 mitochondria in the tail, generating the energy that the sperm needs to get to the egg. The moment the sperm unites with the egg, the tail falls off and is lost. The DNA contents, that caused me to have slightly bow-legged legs like my dad, low back pain like my dad, periodontal disease like my mom, that all comes in through the nucleus, or the DNA that's housed in the nucleus. So when the sperm unites with the egg is the keeper of all the mitochondria that you will then have for the rest of your life. And those mitochondria are really, really interesting. In fact, it was Carl Sagan's wife, Lynn Margulies, who realized, and this was on the backs of lots of other scientists, that the DNA of the mitochondria, separate from the DNA that gave you blue eyes or my bow-legged legs, looks exactly like bacteria, because in fact it is similar or identical to bacteria. So there's the theory that an organism housing a bacteria united with a larger cell and thus created life as we know it. So the other thing about mitochondria, in addition to generating energy, is they determine when the cell is going to die, otherwise known as apoptosis. It is the mitochondria that determines that this cell is no longer viable, and it undergoes changes. It releases information into the cytoplasm or the fluid of the cell, which encourages it to die. So the more mitochondria you have, the more energy you're able to generate. So when you take in food in the form of carbohydrates, protein, and fat, and it's combined with oxygen, it combusts to create ATP. That is the currency of energy that is allowing me to stand here in front of you, have you breathe in and out, digest the food you just ate, etc. It also releases a bit of heat. So this is a little bit more complicated slide, but the reason why I show it to you is here is glucose. There should also be protein and fat going into the mitochondria, and then it goes into the Krebs cycle. And anybody remember studying the Krebs cycle? Memorizing all the steps of the Krebs cycle, only to forget it as soon as the test was over. Well, today we can measure those steps. I can do testing on people that allows me to see each of these intermediates as the body is going around that circle and generating ATP. I'm going to call your attention for a moment to the NAD. Just remember that that's up there because we're going to talk about that in a moment. But that's how you, going around and around and around right now in that Krebs cycle, is how you're generating energy. And I included this slide because this is actually taken from one of the tests that I run on people to see what's happening in the citric acid cycle or the Krebs cycle. So at each of these points, which is probably very hard for you guys to see back there, if it's in the green shaded area, you're making an appropriate amount. If it's either too much or too little, I know that something's blocking normal movement that allows you to generate energy. And we now know what nutrients are needed to drive those reactions from one step to the other, and what toxins, we don't know all of them, we know many of them, but what toxins are preventing you from going from point A to point B, or point D to point E, etc. So how do we protect our mitochondria? If we know that we need them, we're dependent on them, and in fact you know that you need it, because a very effective way people have used to die is carbon monoxide poisoning, right? What happens with carbon monoxide poisoning is you don't get adequate oxygen, and the mitochondria seize. They stop functioning. So you've got about 4 minutes in order to recover from that. Otherwise, the mitochondria are irreparably damaged. So we want to protect them at all costs. And so what we're protecting them from day by day is basically oxidation or rust. And these are some of the nutrients that the mitochondria needs to continuously repair itself. Do you recognize these? A really good multivitamin will have all of these. A really good diet will have most of these. Probably won't get as much CoQ10 in a really good diet If you don't eat meat, carnitine might be a little bit harder. Lipoic acid can be a little bit tough, but many of these are in a very good diet. But this could be a reason why people would want to take a very good multivitamin. There are some other things that we've discovered help protect and preserve our mitochondria. How do you know about resveratrol, for anybody who's heard of it? Grapes, exactly right. Who had the red wine tonight? Enjoy. In fact, Pinot Noir has the highest concentration of resveratrol. So if you're a red wine drinker, you want to have Pinot. The other things that do that are omega-3 fats. And interestingly, a reduction in calories. We're going to look at that in a moment. But when we overeat, we actually damage mitochondrial function. If you were to look at the mitochondria under the microscope after you have overeaten, they are not running through that cycle as well as they could be. They become inefficient and overwhelmed. And exercise is the other thing that builds mitochondria. Who has heard of NAD? Qualia, or let's see, Basis, or True Niacin. Has anybody heard of these supplements? You've heard of it. Okay, so NAD, remember I said notice the NAD that's off to the side. NAD also helps generate energy for us. There is the same guy who discovered resveratrol has been working very hard on producing NAD, and so there are a few products out there. Now, if you take NAD, blood levels, if you take these products, and I own no stock in any of those products, if you take them, your blood levels will go up. That's what the studies have shown. However, we don't know how that translates. We don't know if that matters. We do know that with aging, NAD levels go down. We do know that stress brings NAD levels down. But we don't know if actually taking a supplement, and by the way, these are some of the more expensive supplements on the market. So are they nootropics? They are exactly nootropics. So a lot of the biohackers are advocating for this. And some people will say, I feel much clearer, my brain feels sharper, but the studies don't really show yet that they have a big impact on well-being. All right, so now I'm going to pull the lens back and look at you on a larger scale. And one of the most important systems that help us generate energy are hormones, right? Because hormones are really they're the messengers of the body. They're being released there's information being released by the brain that's directing stuff all over the body. So it includes insulin, thyroid, adrenals, your sex hormones, particularly estrogen and testosterone, and vitamin D, which is actually a hormone. We take it as a vitamin. It sounds like a vitamin, but it's actually a hormone. If you've developed insulin resistance, which is such a huge problem in our society today, insulin is absolutely needed in order to get sugar into the cell. And remember, that sugar is then converted to ATP. But if your body is seeing carbohydrates over and over and over again in an excessive amount, those little finger-like projections that were on the surface of the cell that are responsible for receiving information from insulin, opening up to let sugar in, your cell actually starts dismantling those receptors. That is what insulin resistance is. That's what prediabetes is. Now, we don't do an aggressive enough job monitoring everyone for prediabetes, because if you're pre-diabetic, you already are behind the 8 ball. And so what is a pre-diabetic? If your fasting blood sugar is consistently above 90, now conventional labs will say 100, 110. We feel that's too high already. If your hemoglobin A1C is above 5.5, that, by the way, is a number that everybody should be getting checked every year that they get their blood drawn, or twice a year. You want the lower, the better. If you're fasting insulin, which is something I rarely see doctors checking on patients, but that's very, very important. You want your fasting insulin level less than 7. And if it's not there, if your numbers are higher than that, your cells are already developing a resistance to your own insulin, and you're on your way to develop prediabetes or diabetes. So you want to get on that, and getting on that means increase activity and decrease the carbs. We were not designed to take in the amount of carbs, most of us, that we're taking in these days. Carbohydrates are used for fuel. Protein is used for creating enzymes, making neurotransmitters, repairing tissue, making muscle. Fats are the backbone of hormones. They're the cell membranes. They have all these other jobs. Carbohydrates have one job, fuel. So if you're Lance Armstrong, eat carbs. You need them because you're fueling a machine that's using up a lot of energy. But if your days are spent sitting, that's not a lot of energy use, right? If you're not physically active, you don't need as many carbs as we're being exposed to. Thyroid, boy, I see hypothyroidism all day long, particularly in women, definitely as we age. The thyroid, which is a gland located right here, tends to get sluggish as we get older. I suspect it has something to do with our toxic exposures, just the amount of exposures that we have, heavy metals, different chemicals that are in our environment. Over 800 different kinds of chemicals have been released into the environment. About 100 of them have been tested in human health since World War II. So it doesn't look pretty for us. And I think the thyroid is exquisitely sensitive to those kinds of things. When you get your blood drawn, most often your doctor is just checking TSH. That is inadequate because really the workhorse of the thyroid is T3. When T3 lands on the surface of the cell, that's what gets the cell active. And that's what thyroid hormones do. They activate the cell. So if it's a stomach cell, it's going to make more acid. If it's a pancreas cell, it's going to make more insulin and digestive enzymes. Whatever the job that cell is, T3 activates it and has it produce more of whatever it is it's supposed to make. So please make sure you're getting full thyroid panels every time. Because look at the plethora of symptoms that we can have if our thyroid is under-functioning. It affects every system in the body. Your hair, your skin, your nails, your heart, your blood vessels, your weight, everything gets affected by low thyroid function. Next, we have your adrenal glands. Where are your adrenal glands? Above your kidneys, exactly right here. Your adrenal glands are responsible for creating the fight or flight response. They're also responsible for sodium balance, blood pressure, a couple of other things. When we are under pervasive stress, the adrenals pour out cortisol and DHEAs. Epinephrine we can't measure because it's extremely short-lived in the blood system. DHEA and cortisol stick around a little bit longer. Now, cortisol is critical. It starts rising at 4 o'clock in the morning. It peaks about 8, 9 o'clock in the morning. It's what gets you up and going. It releases some sugar from your liver so that you've got something to work with, start getting going in the morning. It raises your blood pressure, which is why we see more heart attacks at 6 o'clock in the morning, because your blood pressure is going up, your platelets are a little bit stickier. So cortisol has this rhythm to it every 24 hours. It drops as the day goes on. It's very low at night because you're going to bed and you don't need to be stimulated. And then it starts rising again at 4 a.m. That's a normal cortisol rhythm. Many of us under stress will raise our cortisol because we're trying to respond to the ongoing stress. And after a while, the adrenals can't seem to produce as much cortisol, and that curve starts coming down. DHEA is a different hormone. It's a hormone of great vitality. You made a tremendous amount of it in your 20s. I used to say it's why people could go out and party all night and then go to work the next day, which seems like a completely loathsome idea to me at this age. But it used to be fun, I think, when I was 18 and 19. DHEA is in part responsible. It helps repair damaged tissues. It gives us energy. So DHEA decreases every decade of life after your 20s. Some of us have preserved it. I measure these levels all the time, and some of us have preserved our DHEA levels. But if we've been under a great deal of stress, those levels are typically quite low. And like the thyroid, if the adrenals are not functioning well, we'll see a whole host of other symptoms. as well. A big one can be carbohydrate craving or salt craving. Finally, we have the sex hormones. Both estrogen and testosterone contribute to our libido, our ability to focus and have clarity and drive and ambition and energy. And notice what's the molecule at the very top of that list? Right, you're making your hormones out of cholesterol. And what are we busy doing with you guys all the time with our statin drugs? Which, by the way, I am not against. I've flip-flopped on that. I am not anti-statin the way many of my functional medicine colleagues are, because I think it has a very powerful anti-inflammatory effect, and that's why I really think it protects us from heart disease. But we have been waging a war, I spoke last time about cholesterol, against cholesterol, but in reality, we need it. We need it to make pregnenolone very important for the brain. Progesterone, estradiol, and testosterone also incredibly important. These levels tend to go down. In women, when we go through menopause, there's a dramatic drop in estrogen. We don't see the same drop in testosterone. Testosterone tends to maintain a pretty steady level and then just sort of quietly tapers down. Having said that, some women's testosterone drops faster. I will tell you, I am seeing much lower testosterone levels in men today than I did 20 years ago. And in fact, they've changed the textbooks because testosterone levels in men in like the 50s and 60s was much higher than the average testosterone level in men now, which has me very concerned. And we think it's likely due to the amount of pesticides and other chemicals. So atrazine, Roundup, you've heard recently about the lawsuit against Roundup. We've known, the data has been out for a very long time, that these common chemicals that are being used alter the sexuality of organisms that were in the fields or downstream from the fields that were using those. And we are definitely seeing lower testosterone levels. Men and women, if you're not happy with your energy, you should have these levels checked and that they should be optimized. I don't think we should take a 70-year-old man and give him a testosterone level of a 22-year-old, but normal range for men is 300 to 1200. If you're at 323 and you don't feel good, there's plenty of wiggle room for you to be benefited by testosterone. We have to be thoughtful about it. There are some circumstances where we would want to be cautious. But in general, we do benefit by having extra amount of those hormones. Again, I don't say it's universally for everyone, but it's something to consider. Okay, and then there's vitamin D. Everyone should know their vitamin D level. Does anybody know their vitamin, besides Ann, does anybody know their vitamin D level? Good, okay, that's really important. You know it.
I know it's too low.
You know it's too low. And look at us, we live in Florida. We should have the highest vitamin D levels. The thing about vitamin D is this, and I probably shared it at other, I don't lack from sun exposure. I happen to feel best when I'm in the sun, and I don't slather on sunscreen every hour the way my dermatology colleagues would have me. And my vitamin D level tends to be very low. There are a lot of gene defects that make you unable to convert the sun's rays to vitamin D. So I happen to have one of those gene defects, so I can't convert the sun's rays. Your vitamin D level ideally should be around 50. So the range is 30 to 80 or 100. You're going to want to be at least at 50 in order to prevent all these issues. Remember, we didn't used to wear so many clothes, right? Now we cover, I'm in a jacket indoors, it's 80 degrees outside. We didn't used to live like that. Other sources of depletion can include chronic low-grade infections. Anyone who's had a sinus infection knows what I'm talking about, but many of us can live with a low-grade infection in our sinuses with either yeast or fungal or MARCoNS, which is an antibiotic-resistant form of staph. So that needs to be checked. Dental infections, I'm unfortunately facing that. But root canals, people who've had a low-grade infection in a tooth from a low-grade abscess. And then there's the gut, which is very often a source of chronic low-grade inflammation that people just sort of live with. If you experience bloating after eating, that is absolutely abnormal. And that may come as a shock for some of you who are used to feeling a little bloated. And what bloating means is your stomach sort of poofs out and you feel uncomfortable. When you eat, it should be a non-event. You should feel no different. In fact, you should feel energized, not tired. I just took care of a patient earlier today, and the father said, all of my life, I needed a nap at like 2 o'clock after lunch. My whole professional life, I figured out a way to take a short nap at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And then his daughter was diagnosed with celiac, and he's the gene carrier for it, meaning he can't tolerate wheat. And what did he have every day at lunch? Right? Bread of some sort. So he had been exposed to chronic low-grade inflammation that caused this fatigue. So food sensitivities are an incredibly common source of low-grade gut inflammation that leads to this sense of fatigue, as does an imbalanced gut flora, because it's your gut flora working with your immune system that keeps your bowel lining, your gut lining, healthy and strong. And when that gets denuded or injured, there are food substances, molecules from your food and other debris that you've gotten exposed to through eating that leak across into the bloodstream, and your immune system is constantly trying to kill it off, okay? And then there are toxins that we may be getting exposed to. Some are known, some are unknown. This is an example of what's in a common face cream. They say the average woman has an exposure of 250 chemicals before she leaves the house every day. You just look at some of the ingredients on some of the personal care products that you use, whether it's shampoo or lotions or what have you. Good old coconut oil is great for so many things. You can get a big thing of it at Costco. It's organic. That's your best moisturizer, really. And then many of us here got exposed to mercury amalgams because it's all that they were using. It's all that some dentists still use. That is an amalgam of different metals, but the dominant metal in there is mercury. And when you brush your teeth, when you drink hot drinks, when you grind, like I love nuts, but when I eat nuts, tiny fragments are breaking off, and I'm either inhaling them or swallowing them. So we've got an ongoing exposure often to mercury. What fish are high in mercury? Who remembers? Tuna? Swordfish? Not sardines. Sardines are the lowest, and they're one of the best fish that you could be eating. So if you could tolerate them, please incorporate. Sardines really, if you're not a vegetarian and you eat fish, sardines should be in your diet regularly. But swordfish, tuna, the big game fish are the highest in mercury, the big game fish that eat other fish. Things like Febreze. I listen to Pandora, and every 15 minutes there's a Febreze or one of these commercials constantly on it. That's a terrible idea, because you're just inhaling that chemical that you've then got to detoxify. And I have no idea how good you are at detoxifying any of these things. They tend to get stored in fat. They tend to injure mitochondria. So you want to be careful about that. So now we're going to pull the lens back further and start talking about lifestyle. I'm not going to spend too much time on the diet, but the question is, do you fuel yourself properly? I don't think there's any one perfect diet. I think everybody's got to find their diet. The paleo people would have you believe they're the best. The keto people think they're the best. The pagan people, which is Mark Hyman's, I actually think he's probably right, mainly plant-based with a little bit of good, clean sources of meat. And an abundance of phytonutrients. So you know that when you look at your plate, you should be seeing at least half to 3/4 of it filled with veggies. Then you know you're doing a good job. But then the question is, are you absorbing and utilizing your nutrients? So some of us don't do very good, for instance, at absorbing B12. We're supposed to be making intrinsic factor in our stomachs. That's what helps pick up the B12 that's in your food. If you're a vegetarian, you're not even getting B12. B12 is hugely important in making energy. So that has to be looked at. So that NutriVal test that I showed you earlier is one way we identify what are your unique needs for different vitamins. Now, remember I said that calorie restriction increases your mitochondria. And while that monkey on the right looks a little angrier than the guy on the left, these guys are siblings. They were born at the same time. The guy on the right had his diet restricted by about 1/3. He took in 1/3 less calories than his brother. And he lived longer, his coat was fuller, his skin was healthier than his brother did, just by having calorie restriction. Genetically, they were essentially identical. Every organism that's been looked at, if you restrict by about 30%, they live longer and healthier. They have a longer health span through that period of time. So he's angry because he doesn't get to eat as much, but he lived longer and he's healthier. We also see, though, when you restrict calories, there's a delay in onset. It happens much later in the common diseases that we see as we age. So there's something to calorie restricting, including and particularly as we age, that is very good for cell function. It isn't very hard to incorporate things every day that can boost your energy. Green tea is one of my favorite. It's got a lot of protective phytonutrients in it. Ginseng is not spelled right either, in case anybody noticed. B vitamins, again, many of us are low in some of the B vitamins. Vitamin D we talked about, CoQ10, carnitine. These are common nutrients that are used in every cell to generate energy. But things like rhodiola and cordyceps, cordyceps is a sort of mushroom that actually the Russian Olympic athletes, oh no, I lied to you, it was the Chinese Olympic athletes. The Chinese in like the 80s had no good female swimmers. Like that was not a Chinese sport. And then there was an Olympics where the Chinese women began to take a whole bunch of medals. So of course the Olympic Committee was figuring that they were doping somehow, doing something they shouldn't have been doing. Turns out they were using high doses of cordyceps, which allowed them to train much harder, which allowed their times to improve dramatically. Now, who loves coffee? So you'll be happy to hear I would not take away. First of all, because I am a coffee lover, but second of all, if it's being used in moderation, it has a lot of health benefits, assuming, of course, you don't add sugar to it. And the way caffeine works is it looks exactly like the adenosine molecule that you are making right now. And when adenosine hits a nerve fiber, a nerve ending, it stimulates that cell. Caffeine latches onto that same receptor and stays there. So it keeps stimulating that cell. Now, if you're one of those 5-6 cups a day or pot a day coffee drinkers, after those receptors are saturated, you're just hurting yourself. It's not doing you any benefit to drink more. In fact, it's overstimulating your heart, causing you to squeeze out too much cortisol and a whole host of other things. So that's where I definitely draw the line. And remember that the half-life of caffeine is about 6 hours. So if you drink a cup of coffee at 9 o'clock in the morning, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, let's say the average, if you're not drinking Starbucks because their caffeine levels are spiked, if you're drinking regular, let's say Dunkin' Donuts type coffee, and it's about 100 milligrams per cup, by 3 o'clock in the afternoon, you still have 50 milligrams in you. By 9 p.m., you still have 25 milligrams in you. So you're going to bed still with some caffeine on board. Some of us are very sensitive to caffeine, and those folks are not metabolizing it even as fast as what I just described. So if sleep is an issue, you really have to look at your caffeine consumption, because you may be a slow metabolizer of caffeine, and your cup of coffee from earlier today may still be overstimulating your brain. These are some of the things that I'll do to allow me to continue my busy days. Most consistently, I do a B complex and magnesium. And I would say probably most of us need magnesium, vitamin D as well, which I forgot to put up there. And then I will, when my energy slumps, and by the way, it is very normal, very typical to have a slump in your energy around 2, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Does anybody else feel that? That's a normal circadian rhythm, to not be as high at that time. And I ask people all the time, when is your energy the best? Almost no one says, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I feel great. So how do we get more energy at those times? You can do some of these things, but I actually think this is the secret to those slumps. And I really mean this. What fits your busy schedule better, exercising 1 hour a day or being dead 24 hours a day? That image has been in my slide deck since 1997 when I first started giving these talks with Dr. Weil, because I think that's really true. If you can't find time to exercise, this body, with all its musculature, though all those muscles were designed to do one thing, and that's move. And when you don't move, you rust, you oxidize, you fail. So we've got to keep moving. And isn't it interesting that you get energy by expending energy? So I don't want to nag, but we are all losing a pound of muscle a year if we're not regularly working to retain it. Where did I tell you what tissues have the highest concentration of mitochondria? Who remembers? Heart, brain, and muscle. So if you're losing muscle mass, you're losing mitochondria year after year. Every one of us has to have a strength training routine and a cardio routine as well. And then I submit we also need stretching and balance work every day. So if this is you after you've worked out, and I see this in my super uber type A's where they work out and do like spinning Soul Cycle, Orange Theory, Barry's boot camp, all in one day, and then they're exhausted. And when we do certain tests to see DNA damage or oxidation, we see very high levels. In fact, marathon runners, any marathon runners? Former marathon runners? So oxidative damage is off the charts when those people are done with their races. That is the most antithetical thing you can do to your body. I don't believe in that kind of workout at all, because all the biomarkers that we would check show significant damage in the body when you do that. So this should not be you. A good rule of thumb, exercise should energize. And if it's not, it's because the system is already depleted. You got to go back and figure out where that's coming from. Very often I have to take people off of exercise and say you're allowed to walk and you're allowed to do a very gentle yoga class. You can do Tai Chi and Qigong, but that's it, until we've been able to build them back up. So remember that sitting is the new smoking. And I really mean that. Who's gotten themselves a stand-up desk? A stand-up desk? No, you're using one. What do you notice? You do feel better just by making that change. Yeah. Yeah. Days when you were a really good sleeper. Who here is still a really good sleeper? It's not the majority of us, but I'm glad to see a good number. All right, we're now sleeping almost 2 hours less a night than our great-grandparents, which is not good at all, because there are so many critical things that happen during sleep. It's a major source of auto accidents, more than alcohol. In fact, remember the Exxon Valdez? Didn't they originally think it was due to alcohol, but it was sleep deprivation that caused them to make bad judgment? It affects every aspect of who we are, and we're very unpleasant when we don't get enough sleep. We're cranky and irritable, and we're predisposed to depression and infections. This is a major thing that we look at in our patients with cognitive impairment. We work very hard to improve people's sleep habits. Now this is you at night. This is a little bit of a complicated slide, but when you go to bed, you go through these different stages, with deep sleep being the most restorative. In deep sleep, the brain does a very interesting thing. It swells with fluid, which drains toxic metabolic byproducts of chronic thinking and drains it out of the system. It also allows us to produce growth hormone, which is very protective to the body. It's a very youthful hormone that we make only at certain times of the night, deep stages of sleep. So those are critical. When people do not feel they've had restorative sleep, it's usually because they haven't dropped into deep sleep. And the important thing about deep sleep is most of it happens before 3 o'clock in the morning. So if you're one of those people, if you're a night owl, like my son somehow has decided he is, then, and going to bed at 1 o'clock in the morning, you've already lost 2 bouts of deep stage sleep potentially. You had a question?
Oh, no, what I was going to ask.
The night owls.
If you go to sleep like at 12, 1 o'clock, right?
We got to shift you a little bit earlier, unless you feel great. You may be able to drop into deep sleep adequate numbers of time. We do it about 3 times a night. And by the way, we all dream. That happens in the REM stage as we come out of deep sleep. That's what the Ds are. We all dream. We may not remember it because you're releasing a chemical that helps dissolve the memory. You know how when you wake up in the morning and you remember fragments of a dream, and you're trying so hard to remember the dream, but it's sort of like dissipating in front of your eyes? It's because you're producing a chemical to do that, and you do that so you don't mistake the events of your dream from real life. It's actually a brilliant way that the brain separates what's happening in the dream state from what's going to happen in your day-to-day life. So this is really important to pay attention to. The other interesting thing about this slide is see how the arrows come up. It is not abnormal to wake up during the night. Many of us get very anxious if we wake up during the night because then we think, oh my gosh, I'm never going to fall back to sleep again. And we get in that habit of thinking, which is very detrimental to actually relaxing and falling back to sleep. If you look at old literature, they talked about a first sleep, second sleep. Many cultures would wake up during the night, scan the horizon, make sure everything was safe, and then have a second night's sleep. So think of it that way, like you're just doing what your ancestors did. That'll calm you down hopefully a bit, and if not, there are some other things that you can do. So sound therapy, I think, is one of the most effective tools for this. It turns out that the beats associated with Mozart and other classical pieces is very soothing to the brain. But binaural beats, which is an app that you can download, there's several of them. I use the one that's got a blue icon, has beats embedded into the sounds that you're hearing, and that induces the same brain wave form we see when we're in deep meditation. So it quiets the brain from the outside in. So look for that. The other thing you could do is shift over to a breathing technique. There's many of them. I'll use breathing in for a count of 2, breathing out for a count of 4. Remember to prolong the exhale, because it's when you are exhaling that the quieting side of your nervous system dominates. So an inhale is a little bit stimulating to the nervous system, and exhale is more relaxing. So if you exhale for a longer time, you're invoking a calmer nervous system. And then there's a ton of herbs that people use. They have varying degrees of effectiveness. Some people do really well with this. For many people, it's not enough. Melatonin is often used. I think it's very effective for jet lag. The one caveat with melatonin is that it can produce very vivid dreams. And some people love that, and some people aren't so crazy about that. I am opposed to the use of drugs like Ambien, other than in the short term. So if there's a stressful event and someone's not sleeping because of that event, Ambien is perfect. or Klonopin, which I don't like as much because it's highly addictive and very difficult to get people off of. But those drugs do not mimic that sleep cycle I showed you. You do not drop into deep stage sleep. And remember, that's where the body regenerates. That's where you're restocking the shelves. So while it does get you to sleep, it's a lighter form of sleep. So bear that in mind. Use them only short term. If someone's having trouble sleeping, or if energy is something that they want to cultivate more of, I think one of the most important strategies any of us can develop is a practice of meditation. Does anybody have a meditative practice? Great. Wow, good. That's excellent. So the reason why I think this is so key is because we lose a lot of energy when we're in an automatic way of being, when we're in an automatic state as opposed to a quieter, more consolidated state. When we're living in a more meditative state, we're not angry, we're not irritable, we're calm, we're loving, we have gratitude, and those emotional states enhance our energy. It, of course, enhances our outlook. It enhances our relationships. But the other interesting thing about those states of being that we have to consciously cultivate, especially in this crazy world that we're in, is that it induces the most healing physiology you can be in. If you examine all the biochemical markers, the heart rate, the blood pressure, heart rate variability, C-reactive protein, other inflammatory markers, sugar, hormones, the list goes on and on and on. In someone who's in a meditative state, it's everything that enhances healing. So in reality, we should be living in a meditative state. Like that would be the ideal. So if you don't have a meditation practice, find one. There's a million ways to do that. Ask any one of your neighbors that raise their hands. If you do have a meditative practice, don't forget to do it, because it's like the first thing we forget when we're under stress. So, and then there's, of course, breathing. And related to that is this idea of our thoughts. Many of us walk around with rather self-deprecating thoughts. Like, if you took that thought, what you're hearing inside your head, and put it in a person walking alongside you, you'd be like shocked at what they're saying to you. And at some moment, you'd either slug them or run away or do something. You would never tolerate somebody berating you for little things. Oh, you idiot, you forgot. Like, oh, to get so frustrated about small, inconsequential things. I'm as guilty of it as the next guy. But the fact is that depletes us, especially since we all are having the same thoughts over and over and over and over. We don't have many original thoughts day in and day out. So I would ask you to be mindful of what it is you're hearing on the inside that none of us can hear. They can either be enhancing to you or they can be depleting. All right, so I'm going to end and then happy to take questions with some practices that I have found to be really effective in cultivating more energy. One is Chinese medicine and acupuncture. I think this is, obviously this is growing in this country. Acupuncture, we haven't figured out exactly how it's affecting bodies, but we do know that when we do functional MRI, well, we like to do it to students because we can pay them $50 and they'll agree to do anything. So when you inflict pain on a student and you image their brains and then you give them acupuncture and you re-image their brains change and the pain goes away. So there is a concordance between the images on MRI and the dissipation of pain. So it's not, pain is a very subjective thing and it's hard to measure, but when you see the MRI of the brain changing in relation to the changing of the pain sensation, that's pretty definitive evidence. Acupuncture is really effective for a lot of different things. One thing that I have growing in appreciation of is massage, and in particular myofascial release. So there's a growing body of evidence that the fascia, which is that sort of shiny, very thin connective tissue that covers your entire body, when you're injured, whether emotionally or physically, that fascia constricts and it reduces motion of tissue beneath it. Whatever it's encasing, because of its constriction, there isn't the same blood flow or movement to the tissue below. And it's so subtle you won't necessarily notice it. But over time, the accumulation of these subtle injuries cause both physical derangement as well as emotional derangement. And I personally have watched very good myofascial therapists in their very gentle technique. It's far more gentle than massage. Release trauma that people have experienced. It's very effective for things like PTSD, as well as other traumatic experiences that people don't even remember that have been housed. Remember every injury you have ever had, from the time you fell off your bicycle when you were 4 to the breakup with your boyfriend when you were 18 and whatever else happened in between and since, is stored cellularly. Your cells are totally aware, even if it's not in your consciousness. And so some of these gentle therapies can be very effective at releasing that. And when you're holding your whole life and then that's released, that's an amazing sensation. I've been very impressed with the work of myofascial therapists.
So what was that?
That was myofascial. They just gently separate pull the fascia off of the tissues. Tai Chi and Qigong. Maurice, do you want to say anything? Fridays and Sundays, don't forget. I mean, the Chinese really appreciate it because they didn't have the luxury of, every first-year medical student spends a lot of time inside a human body. We see every nerve, every blood vessel, every aspect of a human body. We understand the connections, we understand what the liver looks like, and so forth. The Chinese saw the body as sacred and belonging to your ancestors, so they didn't investigate it in the way that Western medicine has. And so they had to use remarkable sense of observation. That's why they look at the tongue, they look at your eyes, they feel your pulses. In a single pulse assessment done by a good Chinese medicine practitioner, they're feeling up to 12 different variables. We feel the heart rate, we're feeling rate and rhythm. That's all we've been taught. So they appreciate energy from a very different standpoint. And they've developed over centuries movements that cultivate energy and affect different organ systems. And I've seen remarkable things happen with people who practice this regularly, and this is Qigong. Oh, and that's all I've got. Oh. I guess that's all I've got. Wow. Sorry about that. I don't know how that happened. All right. Thank you for listening. Any questions that you all have?
That Maurice Robinson is here tonight, and he makes this possible. He wants all of us to have a more enhanced life, and that's why there is Tai Chi on Friday mornings at 8:30 a.m. and Sundays at 8:30 a.m. And I think there's even a group that started on the beach at other times. And we're honored to have Dr. Koffler here once a month to lecture and help us live better, longer lives. So thank you guys for all coming tonight.
Numbers.
Right. So the question is, what biomarkers do we use to actually measure mitochondrial activity? There's no way to measure numbers. I mean, you'd have to undergo a painful biopsy, and no labs are doing that currently, except for experimental. But that test, that Nutrival test, and there's another one called organic acids testing, is a way of seeing the intermediates. Are you producing the right amount of all those chemicals that we expect to see as you're generating energy, or are some too low and some too high?
Fatty acid profile.
We can look at a fatty acid profile as well. Good question. Yeah. Uh-huh.
What about blue light?
Blue light as opposed to
Meaning,
the impact.
say that the
I don't know if it reduces mitochondria, but it definitely affects sleep, which can ultimately affect mitochondria for sure. But I don't know about data around blue light and reducing mitochondrial numbers. I mean, it could. They're photons, they're light, so perhaps it could, but I don't know the data. What is leaky gut? What is leaky gut? Good question. So leaky gut, which conventional doctors hate that term, so use the term increased intestinal permeability. That's the more scientific term. And it's probably, from our standpoint, it's more accurate. Leaky gut, normally the cells of your gut wall are adherent. There's no way anything can get through. That's a healthy gut. When you get exposed to Advil, ibuprofen, Motrin, prednisone, antibiotics, alcohol, stress, did I leave anything out? Actually, the birth control pill and some other chemicals, Zantac, Pepcid, Nexium, those medications, you get injury. Oh, or if you've had a parasitic infection, if you've had traveler's diarrhea or anything like that, you get injury to the lining and you get tiny little gaps between cells. And so you get a leaking of what you're eating and drinking. Because when you eat and drink, it isn't as if everything just gets absorbed into the system and circulated around. Not at all. You devote 30% of your daily calories are given to just the gut, because the gut, essentially after the stomach and to the rectum, if you were to cut that piece out and lay it all out, all the folds that are in there, it equals the size of a doubles tennis court. That's the surface area of your bowels right now. And the reason why so much space is devoted to that is because everything that comes through the system, everything you swallow, is being carefully analyzed and being handpicked in. Those receptors, remember those little finger-like guys on the surface of a gut cell, is consciously choosing, okay, we need more of this, let that go by, that's a bad guy, alert the immune cells, let the other bacteria know. Like, there's this major flurry of activity every time you eat and drink. So that's what leaky gut is. If there's injury to the gut wall, then those things that are normally kept out start seeping in, which activates your immune system. And we can measure that now. There's a test called zonulin that we add when we do stool tests on patients. Not traditional, again, I'm sorry, but not traditional testing, but when we send it off to other less conventional labs, they look at your digestive function, they look at your microbiome profile, they look to see if you have parasites, and they can look to see if you are producing this marker that only gets released if there's leakiness in the gut. Yeah. Any other questions? Uh-huh. Oh, yes, I do. I practice at the University of Miami. I just started there in October. We just started our clinic about 3 months ago now. It's just me right now. I will be hiring a staff, and we just raised the funding to build out a center, which will be at the top of the CRB building for anybody who's familiar with the med school campus. We're building a whole clinic there. So I'll have a team of providers that will happen. But I am seeing patients. I see them at Lennar on Fridays and at the med school on Mondays right now. We're trying to get more space.
Where is that med school?
Where's the med school? At the intersection of 836 and 995. Jackson Memorial, that's right, Jackson Memorial. That's where the medical center, yeah. Yeah, Medical Center is there. Any other questions? Thank you guys so much for your attention.